Hello and welcome. I am Marissa Lavin. Quick about me for those of you who do not know me a little bit who I am and what I do. So I'm raising 3 sons in South Florida, and I support people who seek to restore their health with a natural medicine called homeopathy. And I run a natural education program for homeschoolers called Soul to Soil. I am super blessed. But if I kind of get to the essence of who I feel I am a curious woman who continues to free myself from fear-based stories by running everything that I thought I knew through the lens of syntropy. I repeat this beautiful word over and over, this word syntropy. And basically what syntropy is to me is it's a perspective that is guided by nature and powered by love. So who better to join me to reflect and to share anecdotes and insights from nature than a dear friend and a syntropic sage named Sovereign. Sovereign, you want to jump in and join me? Hi.
Yay.
Do you like that intro?
That is lovely. I love it. Powered by love. Yes.
Powered by love.
I'm with you.
It's hard to reduce it into just a few words, but doing the best I can to have everybody acquaint themselves with this word with us. So tonight, before we go in, we're going to talk about germs tonight, you guys. And Sovereign, I'm just curious, have you ever been a germaphobe?
There has been a little spell in my time on the earth where I fell prone to the fantasy of using spray cans and bottles and wipes to get rid of the things that were actually helping both my microbiome and my overall resilience actually get stronger. And it was right around the time that I had our first baby, Josh. And I went on this little spree, like, oh my God, I've this little one and I got to get the germs out. And that was during the same period that I was on a big health revival journey. And the spell didn't last very long because I realized that a lot of it actually wasn't necessarily true, but I had a germaphobic short spell.
A phase. Got it. I love a spell, a phase. It was just a phase. Well, I did too. I definitely grew up really grossed out by germs. I probably had a disgust relationship with them. And what was interesting was I wasn't really naturally a clean freak. I just would force myself to sanitize because my idea was that germs could make me sick. So I was pretty disgusted by anything germ related. And I assumed that unless something was thoroughly disinfected, I could get sick pretty much from any surface that I touched. I assumed that if it was bleached, it was clean and safe. And if it wasn't, it was just dirty and disease causing. So once again, a complete 180 from where I am today, as I've mentioned before. So like you, that spell has ended. And I wanted to fill you guys in on a conundrum that I'm having tonight, because my goal with these talks is to simply let you in on a new and maybe not commonly shared perspective so that you can make up your own mind and from a well-rounded, well-informed place. No one finds truth from listening to one version of a story, right? So, but here's the thing. So microorganisms, or germs, as we colloquially call them, they're so important, and it's such a huge topic that my fear was going into tonight that I wouldn't be able to do them justice in just this 30-minute conversation. And just to give you an idea, I think, Sovereign, you and I have revealed that we don't necessarily believe that germs are the source of all disease. That I personally, at least, believe that germs get a bad rap, and if we only knew a fraction of the importance that all germs play, not just the good ones. I hear a lot about that, tales of good and bad with germs. I think we would completely shift not only our way of thinking and but our way of acting regarding disease. And I think there would be an entirely new set of relationships with germs and with even disease, and it would shift our attitudes, our actions for the better, in my opinion. So that's kind of the spoiler alert of tonight's journey, and I'd like to dive right in if you guys are ready. You ready, Sovereign?
I'm going to just sit on the sideline and take some notes here.
I
encourage anybody else to do, of course.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to introduce my perspective tonight, and I'm hoping to guide your own pursuit of science, and microbiology specifically as our topic, our scientific topic of the evening. And, who knows, if you guys want to dive in further, we might do more talks down the road. But for now, I just want to go into where this connects with what we've been talking about so far. And really, we've been diving into and reevaluating the norms that have been developed around disease. So just to recap some of our past conversations, we started with this syntropic exploration with just kind of picking apart society's views about health. And we started by talking about stories. We discussed the idea that everything, whether it's scientifically observed or personally witnessed, is interpreted through stories. And these stories reflect our individual beliefs combined with societal belief systems. And then we went on to, in our second talk, we talked about illness and this idea that I used to relate to it as an experience that I wanted to avoid, that I wanted to prevent. And that's not an energy, as you and I discussed, Sovereign, that you find in nature. That's kind of an unnatural relationship with illness. And, instead, the recommendation was to see it as an opportunity to learn that illness is potentially serving a function and to use it as an opportunity for adaptation to build resiliency. So then last week, I felt like I had kind of gotten warmed up in those first two conversations, and I brought in some information from my own personal exploration when I started to question like how disease spreads. And we went from like three distinctly different angles. So one, we looked at this specific research study that if you can, Sovereign, if you can post the link to, you'll just be able to see the abstract, but it's worth purchasing the study and reading the whole study. But it was an experimental research study commissioned by the U.S. Public Health Service, and it was published in 1919 in the heart of the Spanish flu pandemic. And it couldn't seem to demonstrate this idea that illness spreads from one human to another through the biological material, the droplets. Even after swabbing, spraying, and even injecting the biological material of an infected person to a healthy person, and even performing direct, non-socially distanced contact, like having a sick person cough in the face of the healthy person. This was the study that was done. And, so worth looking up if you get a chance. Then we kind of took a historical angle. So we looked at influenza, which is like the most pervasive infectious disease, I guess, arguably, but, still around, still, bothering us today. And we talked about pandemics of the past when disease spread faster than transportation could travel with an infected person. So we talked about it like moving faster than a horse could gallop, or we talked about ships at sea that were spontaneously infected after not having been exposed to anybody from the outside for months. So that was kind of an interesting angle. And then we kind of looped it all together by looking at from the world of molecular biology and microbiology, where now we know that raindrops actually have microbes as the nucleus to ice particle formation and to droplet formation. And, it's interesting because we found that they travel in clouds very long distances and will rain down on other areas. So there's another kind of mode of transport that's not human to human or animal to human, right? It's the weather. And I'm just curious, Sovereign, when's the last time you got a cold and you blamed it on exposure to germs from the rain? Have you ever done that?
I have never come up with that notion, but it's my next form of outsourcing my responsibility.
Next blame game right there. I gave it to you. So, and by the way, I actually had some people on my my Instagram who said, "Oh, is this why people thought that that you catch a cold because of the weather. And, that's definitely not what I'm implying. So I just wanted to clarify that I don't expect you to wear masks and hazmat suits in the rain to protect yourself from the germs. The point is just that it's interesting how we have these stories, and they're not, if we were really believe that droplets are the source of disease, well, then we kind of have to take into account the weather in addition to just our proximity to infected humans or animals. So, all right. So on that note, let's learn a little bit more about germs. This is just how my process works. When I deconstruct something, then I like to go a little further, accumulate a little knowledge, and play around with it. So I'd love to do that with you guys tonight. So I mentioned in the description for this talk that in the field of microbiology, which has been around for a long time, but it took this giant leap in 2007 when scientists began mapping the human microbiome. And when I talk about the microbiome, you referenced it too, Sovereign. We're just talking about essentially that it's like a collection of the genomes being just the blueprints, the little DNA or the information scripts, the message scripts of microorganisms, all of them residing in or around the human body. So, and we're talking about bacteria, we're talking about parasites, we're talking about fungi, and most of us have heard of the microbiome in reference to the gut, but actually microorganisms are all over and within the tissues of the body. So, and just to kind of give you a picture of it, like it's about 2 to 6 pounds estimated of us are germs. Microorganisms and germs being kind of like interchangeable terms. And they're in these unfathomable numbers. Like when when microbiologists start talking about the numbers, it's like my mind just like shuts off. I can't even imagine how many and how many different types there are. And in this Human Microbiome Project, we started to kind of map this and see all the different types of gene sequences in these microbes. So in the most general sense, the germs, as I said, that we're familiar with are bacteria, fungi, and parasites. And then there are some other ones that I didn't want to bring in tonight because I didn't want to confuse. But the one that is most talked about, at least in the last 2 years, would be, in my opinion, viruses. So I wanted to just kind of share a few fun facts about viruses. So there are more than a quadrillion individual viruses that exist on Earth. That's, 10 nonillion, which is basically 10 to the 31 power, which is 100 million times the number of stars in the sky. And that's just what's floating through our air, in our seawater, and in our soil, and even in our bloodstream at any given moment. They're everywhere. Viruses are nanoparticles, so meaning they're smaller than the wavelength of viable light. So we need extra special microscopes just to view them. And I wanted to just kind of, like I did with how disease spreads, like just go over the story that is told most often about viruses. And, I'm sure you guys have heard this. This was the story that I have been told and believed thus far, that basically a virus infects a cell, it goes in, it gets into the nucleus, it forces itself to be replicated, and then it spreads and it wreaks havoc on the body by way of symptoms, right? So if we get a viral illness, we're looking at fever, mucus, maybe coughs, vomiting, loss of taste and smell, body aches, difficulty breathing. I'm sure we're all very familiar with this panel of responses from the body. And, pretty impressive for a tiny nanoparticle, right? To elicit that kind of a response from the body, that you would think it must be a very complex organism to be able to do that in a human system. But what's interesting is if you actually look at the structure of a virus, it's actually not complex at all. And, to my knowledge, at least, I've only been able to find that it's essentially made of a single strand of microRNA. So like a little piece of a message, kind of like a piece of the blueprint. And it's wrapped in a vesicle, like a bubble. It's like an info bubble, like a message in a bottle. So, and then here's the kicker. So viruses, unlike bacteria and fungus, parasites, they seem to be non-living. And for years, virologists have clarified that they're not really alive. And, because in order for something to be living, it has to fit certain criteria. And one of those criteria is that it independently carries out metabolic activities. So like, for example, it generates energy. Has to be able to generate energy. And viruses don't seem to have mitochondria, which are like the powerhouses, like the engines of cells. So I guess, in that sense, you can't really say they're alive. And then another thing that living cells do is they reproduce themselves, right? And we only see viruses reproduce when they're inside of a living host. So like when they're with some human cells, then we see them reproduce, but like floating around the air and the sea and, where we see them in nature, we don't see them. They can't replicate themselves. They don't have the machinery to do that. So now I wanted to imagine, like, let's all put a scientist lab coat on. I was going to put on a hat, but it makes more sense to put on a coat, right? And we're going to become microbiologists right now. So let's imagine we are looking into our electron microscope that can see these tiny, amazing particles. And on this slide that we have carefully prepared, we have a human cell or a group of cells, and then we have what we believe to be a disease-causing virus. So what would we see? Basically, what it seems is, and if you've ever seen pictures of this, you see a virus outside the cell, and the virus gets inside the cell, and in most cases will go into the nucleus, and then some seconds, minutes, an hour later, you'll see tons of these viruses inside the cell, and then even outside the cell, like exiting the cell. So here is my question. Upon seeing that, how do we know that the virus wasn't invited in? How do we know that the cell didn't decide that that message inside that little bubble, the virus bubble, was important enough to send the virus or to bring it into the cell, and then decide to make copies of it so that it could send this message out to other cells and tissues of the body to stimulate maybe like a healing response? So maybe like a cleanup of some sort. So like maybe in that message, the cell discovered that the body wants to boot out, some kind of, toxic substance. So maybe via vomiting, diarrhea, cough, mucus, sweat, fever, right? Fevers are like controlled burns. We'll talk about that next week when we go into infection. But, what's so interesting is that I don't really hear microbiologists. And I decided about a year ago, I started following all these microbiologists on Instagram and Facebook, and they post these really cool videos, a lot of them of what they see under their microscopes. But it's so interesting when you read the caption, because everybody is telling this tale, if it's of a virus, but even if it's of a bacteria, they talk about this tale of hijacking and, opportunistic infection and, disease causing. But I'm looking at what they're seeing. And when you just look at it, it's like the story comes after you see it, like this story is created after the fact, or it was taught before. And then just like we said about stories, now what I see is influence and being filtered through this story that I've heard about these, evil, nefarious things that aren't really living, are tiny, and are everywhere. So let's just listen to the story one more time. So this is the story that this unfathomably ever present. There are, nonillions of these things, okay? Teeny weeny, invisible to the naked eye particle called a virus that has many different types. Some of these types hop onto a human, break into a cell like a home intruder, crack open the nucleus, and take over the replication machinery, forcing our cells to reproduce it so that it can wreak havoc on the body and force humans to spread it to other humans, even though it's already incredibly prevalent and accessible even from a simple breath of indoor or outdoor air or a swim in the ocean. So, my question, and Sovereign, I'd love for you to chime in a second. Does this story still seem true if we are truly objective about what we see under a microscope or even just in our day-to-day interactions? Are we sure that germs, viruses included, are we sure that they are the cause of disease just because of this phenomena that we've seen under an electron microscope? Thoughts, Sovereign?
Well, I have some thoughts on this, and I love everything you're bringing in, and I love the picture that you're bringing in that so-called virus or the germ coming into the human cell, and the question being, well, is it not necessarily invited? And in the observation outside of story of what we have been told, and really looking at what life is doing out in nature, that is the most clean observation there is to be made. The other version, or the old story, is one of that life is against us. And so when we start unpacking the syntropic lens and we look at how syntropy throughout life is manifested, is operating, and is witnessable, and what life is doing as opposed to what life isn't doing, life isn't working against life. And so we have some flawed narratives and some flawed stories that become, by looking through this syntropic lens, actually evident. And then, of course, we can figure out where do they come from and why are they installed, these stories, the way that they are. That part for some of our listeners may not be, the nicest pill to swallow, but there is a great deal of incentive for the stories that we have been told to have been exactly how they are, because fear sells really good products. I mean, Lysol being one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And what in that process has happened in our consumerist rich society is that we've been programmed in a way, or because of our openness and our believability, we have bought into the narrative that we have to protect ourselves against life. We have to fight against life. We have to do something to make sure that these life forms are not making themselves into our place of residence or home environment. And of course, we all want a clean living environment. It's not like we're not going to be cleaning the floors anymore. Like, this is just, I was just hearing in my head when you gave the introduction, it's like, I can imagine somebody being there being like, what, you mean I shouldn't clean anymore?
I don't clean anymore. My kids will be thrilled, right? I can wipe the counters down, Mom.
But it's the modus of operandi. It's the stories we tell ourselves, what drives our motivation to clean. And if we are germaphobic, well, where did that story come from? And if it turns out that it isn't actually based on the living reality, wouldn't it be nice for our own direct experience to not walk around in fear and panic mode with little Lysol wipes all over the place? But instead be like, yeah, I want my kids to be able to play in the soil, in the sandpit. I want them to roll around in the mud, not because I want to go and wash their clothes all the time, but it actually builds their immune system up, because it's
Absolutely.
what life is doing. And so one of the small things that I did note down is the main strategy of life, and we can go into that maybe a little bit later, but in syntropic agroforestry, it's distilled to QQCL, and it's the main strategy of life, accumulating more quantity and more quality of consolidated life. And that is actually what's happening when the germ goes into the cell. It says, oh, come in, you're going to teach me something that is going to allow me to accumulate more quality, because it's just diversity, and more quantity of consolidated life. But we may touch on that a little bit later. Back to you.
No, it's so beautiful. Well, so that's kind of my plan, but for next week, and I'll talk about that in a second. But here's what I kind of was reflecting on earlier, as I'm thinking about, like, why does it matter, right? Can we just walk around and let me just keep my fear of germs and disinfect everything and just leave it at that? Like, I've developed this way. It's super disgusting, to have people too close to me and to shake hands, like, that's fine. and I'm not telling anyone to shift their lifestyle for any artificial reason just because the tale they've been told might not actually be the tale. Like, we really have no way of knowing, that our technology is our technology, but the virus and the cell aren't like actually telling us stories. So we have to kind of create those for ourselves. But here's where I really find this idea takes me. So I think about first, like, what is disease? And, working in the natural medical field for such a long time now, I'm well aware of the differences, at least in my field, versus the conventional paradigm, the medical paradigm that I was trained in early in my career. And in the mainstream medical paradigm, diseases are names for symptom patterns, basically. It's not about dis-ease. Like in Syntropy or in nature, we're talking about ease as in, synonymous with balance or harmony, right? And then dis-ease being like, kind of like discord or imbalance. Well, in our mainstream medical paradigm, we complicate it a little bit, right? Because diseases are these specific names for symptom patterns. And because suffering or pain comes along with these sicknesses or these symptom patterns, we make the sicknesses the villain. And of course, we want to avoid it, right? And then we want to try to find the source. And then once we find the source, we want to squash it. We want to smash that bad guy into submission. We essentially go to war with our symptoms, with the illness. But what did I say earlier? Microorganisms are in our body all around and through, okay? In every single tissue of the body, you can find microorganisms. It's not just in the gut. And they outnumber our own human cells. By some estimates, they outnumber our cells like 10 to 1. So, and I'm talking with cells, meaning human cells, like lung cells, liver cells, brain cells, muscle cells. These little germs make up as much as 10 times more of us than the human part, right? The human cell part. So if we in many respects, we're more germs than we are humans, right? So if we blame them, if we treat them with disgust, if we weaponize our medicines and poison them into scarcity, we are essentially fighting ourselves, aren't we? And what's interesting to me is that if, one look at the news lately, and by the way, full disclosure, I have no expertise here since I don't really watch any news. But what I hear is that we are at war with our perspectives and our opinions about one another, basically with our stories. And we're slinging mud, and not the healthy mud made from soil-based microbes, but the lifeless, hateful mud that's made from fictitious tales. So, I really wanted to go in tonight to other microbes, because viruses are the non-living ones, but we have this whole host of other ones that, for anyone who's been prescribed by their doctor to take probiotics, right? That came about, I don't even know when that came about, but that was a long time ago that, we were telling everybody, take probiotics for your gut. But probiotics were considered pro-life, probiotic essentially meaning in favor of life. Antibiotic, for example, being antimicrobial life is technically what that means, right? But probiotics we were including in telling this tale that these are the good bacteria. These are the good guys that will enhance your microbiome. And that perspective was driven by this good and bad, this or that. But what you're saying, Sovereign, is you're introducing this concept of an adaptive mechanism where life creates more kinds of life, not even just more like number, right? Not just, more members of life, but just more different kinds. That, like, if you look at natural systems, there's this concept of biodiversity. Life loves lots of different kinds of life. And why would life love that if some were good, some were bad? Like if there were bad, life does this amazing thing of adaptation, right? So what doesn't have a function and what doesn't serve a positive purpose usually ends up kind of like dissolving and going away, right? There are ways of kind of like, just ending whatever isn't serving. So in this medical paradigm where we're afraid of this outside threat coming from, I guess you would say, nature, right? So if we're afraid of a germ coming in and infecting us, whether it's from a human, an animal, an open air market, and in China or a lab, whatever the story is, it doesn't really matter, right? Because if we understand the relationship with microorganisms is intimately tied to our own identity,
Mhm.
then this war on germs becomes a war on self. And I really think that just that perspective shift would take us to an entire different set of conversations, a set of actions. And I hope that at the very least tonight, that this just provides a stimulus for you to kind of look into this on your own. And most of the information I'm going over tonight is really this is, which is rarely true for my information, is available in a basic internet search. So,
Yeah.
so you can totally put on those Syntropy lenses for yourself and see what does it look like when you objectively look at a health phenomenon that's being described to you. What does the story feel good? Do you need to see peer-reviewed research to look at even just the question that I have about if you were looking through a microscope at this little teeny nanoparticle going into a cell, how do you know whether it forced its way in there, it hijacked a receptor site, or if it was invited in there? Like, how would you know? And if we don't know, then how are we making such strong overarching conclusions and directing actions as though this is the only way out of our health woes through this way of relating, when I don't know, when you look at nature, the way of relating doesn't make so much sense anymore.
Mhm. So great, Marissa. So beautiful. I totally love so many beautiful takeaways that I like to keep sharpening my own mind song with, because I also, before I started studying syntropic agroforestry and applying then the syntropic mindset really onto human ecology and human scenarios, I was very much in the same kind of judgmental tract of good, bad, right, wrong, and found myself very much on the kind of buying into stories out of, I don't know, but these scientists may know that are paid really big bucks to write this stuff, because it's actually all for, we all know that there is a vested interest out there to basically make more drugs available in one form or the other. You need a reason for that. And I'm not wanting to lead it into that there's a bad guy out there, but there are definitely aspects of opportunism that are actually being radically exploited, purely because the way that I looked at myself is that I wasn't able to really clearly think for myself, because I had lenses on that were really clouding my vision. And with that, I was just relying on outside sources that weren't actually tapping into my own inner knowing. And that's what I love about these conversations, that we really get to sit with ourselves, with our feelings, like, is that actually really true for me? So thank you for initiating this great conversation on germs for me and my cells again.
Oh,
Because
my pleasure. And so next week, I actually really am interested, to bring in more, even more of nature and more of your wisdom, because I want to talk about infection. Because it's all well and good that, to hear this new perspective, and then I don't know if you're anything like me, you want to integrate it. Like, okay, but what do I think next time I have like this inflamed like skin reaction, or I'm boiling up with like a 102 fever? So, I want to talk about that next week, like where we see infection and the mechanisms of infection in nature, but also what are other explanations for what could be going on in the body, and what we look to if we're no longer blaming germs. And I think at that point, it's really important to look at the roles of these different microbes, especially the bad ones, right? The ones that have gotten into this bad rap. Like what we talked about, Syntropy, one of the foundational tenets being that everything in life is performing a function with purpose. So if we look at function, it's really awesome because it can kind of clue us into what's going on there. And then we can zoom out and we have a whole host of options and ways to hurt ourselves through what actually might be a natural, eventually beneficial reaction that is not necessarily to be avoided, but honored and supported, so that it causes the least bit of suffering and that the adaptation happens, expeditiously, hopefully, and in a way that strengthens you. So we're going to talk about that next week. So infection will be part 3 of this discussion. But thank you so much for taking this deep dive. And I love hearing about like that little spell that you had, Sovereign, of your germophobia, because, I think it's important that everybody gets to see that you and I are human and we have the same stories going on, you guys. So, but anyway, thank you so much for joining, and Sovereign, thank you so much again for being here.
Nice. Great. I'm just going to leave one last comment in the chat for people to ponder. I think it's a great part to kind of reflect on. It's really everything in life is performing a function with purpose.
Yes, my favorite.
How does this apply to our beautiful germs that are out there scaring us? Or are we scaring ourselves? So great.
So good. All right,
Thank
you guys.
Marissa.
Thanks again for being here.
Now.